I'm Judge Brent Carr, and I'm with the commission. I'm one of the jurists in residence. My background is I created a number of specialty programs, including mental health, veterans, and one for sex-trafficked women charged with felony offenses. And I will be your host for 2 sessions this morning, and our first presenter is here with us. She is going to talk to us about lawyer wellness and handling cases with people who are unwell. She'll ask us what are the ethical considerations of representing a client with mental illness, and as a judge for 32 years involved with mentally ill defendants. I had frequently grave concerns over attorneys who were sometimes moving cases, and I wasn't sure that their clients were with us in the room all the way when that was going on. So this is, I consider, a very important undertaking. We're going to balance the responsibilities of lawyers or system partners at the intersection of mental health and the judicial system. It'll provide some concrete actions that individuals or organizations can make to continue to provide ethical representation and protect the well-being of the professionals involved. So I'm very happy to introduce Jessica Chevrier.
I'll say it. It's good.
She said it was like Chevrolet, but Chevrier. I'm sure I screwed it up again. But thank you very much, and the microphone is yours.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's such a privilege to be here this morning with such a really wonderful organization doing important work. So I get to talk to you guys about burnout today, and specifically about burnout prevention. Burnout is something that a lot of people are talking about, especially as it relates to the intersection with mental health and anybody working with industries that have rates of high attrition. And so it's kind of an exciting topic. However, a lot of people are approaching this topic in a non-systemic way. And what I want to present to you today is a systemic formulation of how we can address burnout in our organizations and prevent, hopefully, burnout. If my clicker will work. Okay, so let's talk about some risk factors here. Any field or industry where there's a heavy workload and long hours, where people are struggling to balance work and life obligations. If you're working in a helping profession, which is going to be pretty much everybody here, and especially if you feel like in your role you have little or no control over your work. Another really good way to see this is if you feel like in your line of work there isn't necessarily a start and stop. A lot of people will communicate when working in the legal field, it's just this constant stream of cases to deal with, and it's not like even though you've closed out a case, oh, there's the next one. And that can aid to this or add to this feeling of not having any control. Let's talk about symptoms. In mental health, we're especially mindful when symptoms have started to present via the body. So that's going to look like changes in sleep habits, too little or too much. Too little or too much is going to be a really important flag to be watching out for in cases of symptomology related to burnout and just really mental health in general. Digestive issues, is there an increase with alcohol or drug use? Headaches, migraines, feeling exhausted, mental emotional symptoms. You heard of the Sunday scaries? That's a term that's become popular in the past few years. If you're not familiar with it, you're probably familiar with the sensation. And that's Sunday night, thinking about what's coming up Monday morning and the dread that can sit in. And maybe sometimes you start to stay up longer than you should in this maybe subconscious effort to hope that Monday never actually comes. But Monday always comes. Increased pessimism, cynicism, feeling really critical of other people. Irritability, difficulty concentrating or getting on task. Imposter syndrome, that's another term that not everybody may be familiar with. Imposter syndrome is a fancy way of saying feeling like you're not good enough in your respective role, regardless of your experience or qualifications, feeling like you're just waiting for everyone to figure out that you actually don't know what you're doing. And it's something that an idea that resonates maybe with a lot of us. Feeling like you're distancing yourself from activities that you used to really enjoy. Let's talk about some social symptoms, okay? And I hope that you're kind of tracking, is this showing up for me? Oh, I am noticing that. Oh, it turns out irritability isn't a personality trait. Maybe I'm struggling with this. Do you have strain in relationships at home or at work? Are you isolating yourself more from others? Do you feel like you're being set off more by smaller and smaller issues, or just things that used to feel inconsequential? And do you feel like, I think this is a really big one, do you feel like you're constantly surrounded by idiots? That can be a big symptom of burnout. Let's talk about secondary trauma a little bit. I believe there's a breakout session that will cover this in more detail if you're interested in this. Secondary trauma is a diagnosis under PTSD, and it's predominantly for those who are exposed by virtue of their work to, I'm not saying this very well right now. So first responders, definitely mental health workers, definitely attorneys working these situations where you're coming across information that is really scary in nature, that really hits you. And sometimes we can see secondary PTSD symptoms, and that looks like nightmares, dreams that are related in theme to these instances that you've learned about. Again, extremes in behavior, too much sleep, too little sleep, loss of appetite, overeating. Are you avoiding any stimulus related to the trauma? So if you know that a crime happened in an area and you start to get those really anxious feelings, do you avoid even just driving in that whole area? Is there an exaggerated startle response? Somebody surprises you or is like, hey, out of the blue, and it's, oh my gosh. Intrusive thoughts. So a good way to describe intrusive thoughts, one of my favorite examples of this, there's a TikTok video that was going around, and it's this little maybe 10-year-old girl, and she sees they're in a cove and there's a cliff on the other side of the cove, and people, as they do, are going to the very edge of the cliff that they're at, and the little girl's watching, and she's like, wow, Mom, they're really close to the edge. And she's like, yeah, baby, they are. And she goes, I just want to push them. And she's like, no, honey, no, we don't do that. We all have thoughts related to that. Not that they're things that we would actually do, but it's more like a cause and effect thought. And there's a whole spectrum of intrusive thoughts. There's thoughts like, whoa, what if they jumped off? And then there's thoughts that are more scary. And suicidal thoughts would fall under this umbrella. So intrusive thoughts, they're really trying to be a form of escaping a difficult situation as well. And if we're experiencing more intrusive thoughts, then that can be a sign that our brain's really having a hard time and it needs some help. Dissociation, this is another word that more and more people are hearing. Dissociation is, to use another metaphor, the mind is like a stage. And when you're fully present in the moment, you are aware of what's going on, what you're saying, and you're embodied in the moment. Differing levels of dissociation can go to extremes of, maybe in the beginning, early dissociation is just kind of like, I'm watching myself on the stage. I'm sitting in the front row. And maybe even more dissociation is you're in the back row and watching yourself on the stage. And we know people and work with clients who sometimes dissociate to the point that they're not even in the room. They're not in the building. So if you're noticing, there's a lot of dissociation that just naturally happens. It's normal functioning. But if we're dissociating to the point that it's really hard to engage in life, then that may be something that we need to visit. Okay, so really want to emphasize throughout this whole presentation, if you take anything away, it's that burnout isn't an individual phenomenon. And I think it's really unethical for us to try to address burnout in our organizations from a place of just self-care. We have to address it from a systemic perspective. And what I offer are 10 points on how we can change cultures and organizations to be burnout preventing and burnout treating. My first point, we must allow questions and not punish or resent people for asking them. I think we can relate to experiences of having maybe not the best boss, and somebody well-meaningly come at the beginning of a job when you first come in, and they're like, yeah, ask me anything. And then you find, as you do ask them anything, they're actually really not okay with that, and they get annoyed by your questions. And the implicit message that we get is, don't bother me, figure this out. That is going to be such a problem and a burnout creator. Because if we don't have permission to learn what we need to learn, and we're just kind of said, you jump off in the deep end, figure out how to swim, a lot of people will drown. And that's where you see a lot of burnout happening. So we need to make sure that people are allowed to ask questions, and we take them seriously, and we really embody that when we say it. We need to talk about shame as well. Shame is, if you're not familiar with Brené Brown's body of work, please become familiar with it. She's an incredible expert on shame and shame resiliency. And shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're fundamentally flawed and that we're not worthy of love and belonging. We have a lot of things that you're going to hear today about evidence-based practices and how to really help people, but I think we also always have to remember when we're throwing out these big terms and scholarly language, that at the root of all of it is that you and I, we're all human, and we have fundamental needs. And some of those fundamental needs, probably the deepest one of all, is that we need to feel love and belonging. And when we don't feel like we belong, when we don't feel like we're connected to a sense of community, then we will feel a huge anxiety inside of us and this feeling of shame, that I'm not good enough. Shame is a universal experience. The only people that don't experience shame are people who are unable to make informed relationships. And shame is one of the most contagious affects that we can feel. Most simply put, it's just that feeling of not being worthy of belonging. I'm not good enough. And to really understand how to create a burnout preventing system, we have to understand how shame, it infiltrates cultures. And in the legal community especially, shame is very present, and we need to become shame resilient to that. So let's talk about a few things that make systems as sticky as they are. First point is homeostasis, and this is one of my favorite words in all of language. Homeostasis is the term really to describe a set point. So if we were to look at your thermostat at your house, whatever you have it at is your home's homeostatic point. And within cultures, within groups, there's a set point for what we are going to keep the anxiety level at. And if we want to change how a culture functions, we have to address where the set point is, what the homeostatic point is. And that's by addressing the rules and the beliefs that keep a system going the way that it does. So at home, with your thermostat, whatever temperature it's at is the rule for that system. And you can go open doors and you can go open windows, and it may briefly change things, but it won't long-term change the actual temperature of your home, because that HVAC system is going to kick up and it's going to compensate. And we see this so often when we have initiatives at work or our New Year's resolutions, and it's cool for 6 weeks and then nothing happens. And that's because we don't address the underlying rules and the beliefs that are functioning within that system, whether it's us individually or within a larger community setting. So let's talk about some of these rules. Rules that, most of the time, rules are pretty implicit things. There's definitely, booklets of policies that offices may run on, but there's a lot of cultural rules that are just quietly implied. And a lot of these 10 points are going to be to try to very explicitly name rules that help systems function. And there are counterpoints of rules that probably exist in a lot of these systems that aren't helping anybody. I love this example because really another rule that happens within communities is how we relate to anxiety. Anxiety, not necessarily meaning generalized anxiety disorder, but anxiety as in that tension that we experience internally within relational systems. And in harmful or really difficult workplace cultures, anxiety can function as like a game of hot potato, where everyone's just quick to try to pass it around and you don't want to hold it. And where we see high attrition rates are going to be with people who don't even know they're coming into a game of hot potato. And then in a lot of these systems, we have power and privilege, where people with more experience or more tenure in an office are playing the game of hot potato with oven mitts. And it's just like, yeah, just hold the potato. It's not a big deal. Why are you complaining? And then you throw it to that first year associate and they're like, this is really hot. Why are we doing this? And you can see that experience of anxiety within systems that are really struggling to maintain people. So how do we step out of playing a game of hot potato with these workplace cultures? This is one of my really favorite examples of how rules can impact systems. And in this instance, unfortunately, it led to tragedy. So in the 90s, Korean Air was experiencing so many instances that really an issue and ultimately culminating in many people's deaths that the US military even forbade their soldiers from using Korean Air because it was too risky. And there was 2 instances where flights led to the death of all on the plane. And so they audited and they tried to examine what was going on, and what they found was that it was a cockpit culture issue. What was happening was you had the captain and then the co-pilot. And within Korean culture, and I speak to this from living experience as a Korean American, in Korean culture it's very hierarchical, and you do not question authority. You do not talk back to your elders. And that was something that was happening in the cockpits, was the co-pilot, if their instrumentation or their data was reflecting something different than the captain's, they were hesitant to say anything. And in this instance where it led to tragedy, they actually hit a mountain. And when they listened to the black box audio, nothing was said until moments before they hit. And even then, it was the engineer that finally spoke up and said, pull up, pull up. He didn't scream. He just said, pull up. And that culture was literally killing people. This culture of not being able to address or bring up issues. Do we find similar experiences within our offices? And is it killing people inside? Another role that is pretty present within the legal community, perfectionism. My dad has this poster hanging in his office and had it for years. And what it says is, it's a lone runner on a stretch of highway, and it says, quality, the race for quality has no finish line. So technically, it's more like a death march. Do we experience perfectionism? Most of us do. And I like to say it's something I've been aggressively wrestling with for the past 8 years of my life. And it can be, there's so many compulsive behaviors that we engage in that we don't scrutinize because they're prettier than the problematic behaviors, even though they're problematic. And perfectionism is absolutely one of them. Workaholism, absolutely one of them. Perfectionism is a shame-based behavior because the idea is that if I work hard enough, there's some gender discrepancies in how we show up with our shame. For men, it tends to be around provider roles. For women, it tends to be around appearance and mothering, which those are incredibly narrow ways to experience humanity. So the shame story, that in my lived experiences, if I show up and I look nice enough, if I sound authoritative enough, if I look dressed enough, and if I'm a good enough mother, then I'll be worthy of love and belonging. Then people will love me. For you, it may be if I make enough, if I'm respected at work enough, then I'll be worthy of love and belonging. But all those things, one, is to outsource your joy to everybody else. And most of those people have no real stake in your life. And 2, you never arrive, and it is a death march. Whereas healthy striving is focused predominantly on, how did I show up in my integrity today? Am I proud of what I put out there? Do we function from a place of doing something and thinking of all the things that went wrong first? You may be struggling with perfectionism. Or can we pull back and see ourselves honestly? You know what? Sure, there are a few things I could have done better, but I am really proud of what I did today. That's healthy striving. That's what we want to go for. So this is a personal rule as well as a cultural rule that we may need to visit related to perfectionism. Okay, point number 2. Trust and appropriate vulnerability are essential in functioning relational systems. So much of working with mental health, and really so much of the legal system, is asking somebody to take some risk, to lean into vulnerability. My husband's a public defender, and so much of what he does is, obviously communicating what his clients' rights are, but also walking them into vulnerability. Yeah, if you want to try this case, I can't make you any guarantees. Ooh, we don't have control. That is unsettling. And if we're working with people, we have stewardship over people, that we're asking them to walk into risk. They're asking other people to walk into risk, into vulnerability. It is so much more sustainable and feasible for them to do that if we're building and developing trust within those relational systems. Trust serves as the bungee cord. We're asking them to jump. And if we don't have trust in that system, we're saying, I don't know, if you end up at the bottom of the canyon, that's on you, dude. What we need, though, is a cord that says, hey, I've got your back. This is going to be scary, and it's going to be different. But you're going to be okay regardless of the outcome because I've got your back. Do we have that in our systems, or does it need to be developed more? Point number 3, the sooner we allow mistakes for ourselves and others, the less expensive the consequences are. Mistakes are going to happen. That is a developmentally appropriate task of being human at every stage of life. You do not get good at something if you're not messing it up. There's an example I saw going around on the internet of a potter who was talking about the pottery class he was leading. And he had one group do one pot every day for 30 days. And then one group do only one pot over the course of 30 days. So they had to perfect that one pot. Who do you think came out with a better quality pot at the end of the 30 days? The people that made 30 pots, because they made mistakes. They figured it out. They were learning. And the people who only made one, a lot of them got just frozen in their perfectionism. And they didn't get to learn from their mistakes. So if we don't allow people in our relational systems, within our workplace systems, to be making mistakes, you're going to have some really expensive mistakes that happen down the line. Because when we don't allow mistakes, we don't allow integrity. And that's when people hide. That's when people make mistakes and they bury it, and it comes out later in ugly, ugly, yucky ways. Number 4, if we do not cultivate time for rest and play, the time eventually demanded will be more than we can afford. Rest and play are fundamental needs. You do not budget the oxygen you breathe. Some of us budget your sleep and maybe need to revisit that. And some of you are budgeting your eating. Your body needs food, and you need to revisit that. But maybe the ground that we can all agree on is no one rations out their oxygen. Those are fundamental needs. Rest and play are fundamental needs of all human beings. And you need to be giving that proactively to yourself. I've presented this particular presentation several times. And one of the times that I did, when I shared this, you know how lawyers can be. And there was an attorney who made a comment quite vigorously, and they said, one of my points with this was that you need to take your sick time, you need to take your vacation time. And when I said that, they were like, judges don't let you take sick time or vacation time, which I'm sorry if I offend any of you honorable judges here. I'm sure you all let people do that. And I'm a snarky brat, and I very quickly responded, not hostily, but very quickly responded with, well, what's a judge going to do if you have a heart attack in the middle of trial? And the room exploded like junior high girls watching a cat fight. And I had no idea what had happened until afterwards. I'm not lying. Someone came up and said the individual that made that comment had had a heart transplant that year because they had dropped down in the middle of a felony trial from their heart attack. I'm not making that up. No, it was like, oh, whoa, I didn't say it on purpose. I'm so sorry. But the point is still valid. If we don't take time for rest and play, your body will demand the time. And you won't get to decide what the consequences are when your body demands it, when your life demands it. So you can budget that time out proactively, or it may be really difficult how it ends up happening. Next point. So much of what stressful work asks us to do is to be in the stress response cycle. And if we're chronically in the stress response cycle and we never get to close the loop, never get to complete the stress response and, oh, it's over now, it's so nice, I'm going to go celebrate, or I'm going to go scream therapeutically, or if we don't get to close that loop, we may find ourselves perpetually in a reactive state. And what I want to push us towards is an intentional state. We're looking at different areas of the brain being activated. If we're in a reactive state, we're in what they call your lizard brain, the back of your brain, the very fight or flight oriented part of your brain. And that is a really hard place to be. If you haven't read What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, incredible book, highly recommend. And something that Dr. Perry points out in that book is when we're in that activated state of our brain, our functional IQ is almost half of what it is in our best brain. I had a client I was working with the other day, and they get really, really anxious around driving. And their wife was like, yeah, they're literally stupid when they're driving. And I was like, oh, well, yeah, their IQ is about half. That's not to say that they're stupid, but that we don't have access to our best resources in those states. When we can be intentional, when we can calm our regulate our nervous system, we can bring our best thinking, we can bring our best brain. And this is where this is your ethics hour. Self-care is an ethical obligation, not just to yourself, which I hope you would think, oh, I deserve to be cared for because I am a human and I deserve to be loved and I deserve joy, but because also you are unable to perform at your best for the people you serve. And you have an ethical obligation to them. So take care of yourself, primarily for yourself, but also because you have an ethical duty to show up as your best self for other people. And you cannot show up as your best self if you're burning out. Self-care, again, most of this is about the rules and a systemic level, but there is also a place for self-care, absolutely a place for self-care. And we should be encouraging and modeling self-care. And self-care is usually touted culturally as, the bubble baths and the pedicures, and I'm a big fan of those things, but it's way more than just that. It's also the things that maybe we don't really like doing, like budgeting. Maybe it's evaluating our relationship with sleep or with food. If you think there are good foods and bad foods, that may be a place for you to get curious because your body needs food. And are you nourishing it? Are you playing? Are you resting? Are you finding time for quiet space to collect yourself? Are you connecting with other people and other relationships? We need all of that. And again, it's something that you need like oxygen. If you are only self-caring after something really stressful has happened, then you're first aiding your mental health, and it won't be sustainable. You have to be proactive. You have to schedule out your self-care on the regular. And let's talk about play for a little bit. Dr. Stuart Brown is one of the leading experts on play, and I love this quote from him. So when he teaches this course, a lot of people will ask, what if we've forgotten how to play? How do we get back to that? And he says, in the last class I gave at Stanford, we had students review their own early play memories, and they tried to remember the purest forms of joyfulness and play in which they engaged in as little kids. By connecting with those memories, whether it was a vacation, a birthday party, first bicycle, or game they started, they were able to find ways to incorporate play in their lives. So if we're not playing, if that idea seems so foreign to you, Brené Brown has a great exercise on this. She asked an audience, we have no conceptualization of adult play. In fact, if I say the word adult play, what do you think of? I don't know, you think of filters on your internet that block things. Because we have no conceptualization of adult play. And that's really sad, because play isn't for children. Play is for humans. And you are human, you need to play. Think of the things that you did as a child that made the time pass by like minutes, made hours disappear. And therein is your work to find your play again. we are all human, if I haven't said that 1,000 times already. And so sometimes we struggle. We're all going to struggle. And we need to take care of ourselves if we need extra care. And I wanted to highlight the TLAP program, which I believe they have a table out here, the Texas Lawyers Assistance Program. If you are struggling with substance abuse, you just need extra care for your mental health, please get the resources that you need and don't delay. So much of why mental health work as a clinician is hard is because so many people will come when it's stage 4 cancer, as opposed to screening or treating earlier. And please don't wait. If you're struggling, there's no threshold of struggling hard enough to get help. You can get help wherever you need, but especially if you feel like you are drowning in your struggle, please get help. Number 5, we need to model the emotional and mental health that we want to see in others. So many times we have wonderful leaders who they want people to take their PTO, they want people to focus on their family, and then they're drowning. They're not doing those things themselves. If you want this for your people, you have to do it yourself. One of my favorite series from BBC, North and South, such a beautiful show. There's a moment where he goes down into the cotton factory and he sees his workers are working overtime and he gets mad, the overseer, and he's just like, why are you working overtime? I don't pay you overtime. And he goes, well, I see you working overtime. And he has to kind of reevaluate. Oh, if you don't want people working overtime, you have to hold yourself to that too. Because the message you send when you say you take your PTO and then you don't is, well, you're not good enough, because I'm up here and you're down there. And they want to emulate the leadership that you're embodying. So if you want people to take care of themselves, you got to do it too. Number 6, we need to ask for help and ask people we lead what support they need from us. Normalize asking for help. Again, this goes back to our last point. If you aren't sharing what you need, then people will also feel like they can't necessarily ask you. And there's appropriate vulnerability. It's not that we overshare, we have to let everybody into every part of our life. But if there's something that you need to delegate, delegate. If you need more support in another space, ask for it. And this beautiful thing happens when we enter that vulnerable space of asking for help and people are there for us, they will also ask for help. And if that's what we want, that's what we have to give. Number 7, when we put outcomes and bottom lines before people and relationships, getting to the outcomes we want will ultimately become too expensive. Sometimes I give this presentation and people say, you know what, that all sounds really well and good, but just most of us live in the real world here. And the real world isn't nice. And, I can't make time for all this woo-woo stuff and like cushioning everybody. And one, that is rank with a whole lot of rules that are actually really problematic and harmful. Rules like we can't take care of ourselves, life is hard, and people don't want to work hard enough. Those are a lot of things that we're hearing culturally that are big assumptions and rules that are problematic. If we have to strip it down to numbers, think of how many hundreds of years of experience have walked away collectively from offices, from whole industries, from whole branches of government because of burnout. And what has that cost taxpayers? When we don't cultivate communities that can prevent and treat burnout, we lose loyalty, and loyalty pays dividends. It may not be things that we see right away, but it's going to save us money in how many people we constantly have to replace, or train and retrain and retrain and retrain. And what of morale? It does not feel good to work somewhere where it's a revolving door. That's really scary. So if we can't bring ourselves to take care of ourselves for our own good, to take care of ourselves for the good of our clients, then we need to, because we also have an obligation when we work within government systems or we work in places where we're accountable for where the funds are going, to make sure that this works on the dollar side too. I work with a lot of soldiers in El Paso and first responders, and something that we learn from working with them is they have a very specific skill set that is applicable in a very niche place. If you're a police officer, those skills are necessary at work when you may be in a life-threatening situation. If you're a soldier, that killer instinct is necessary in a war zone. And lawyers and people working within the legal community, litigation skills, assuming that somebody is out to only protect themselves, that has a very specific place. But it's in the courtroom. It's at work. And where so many people struggle and where burnout can be a big problem is when we overextend those niche skills and we apply them at home. And that's where this example comes in. You may need to duke it out with people at work and in the courtroom, but it's going to be really difficult on your life if you cross-examine your spouse all the time, if you cross-examine your kids all the time. There are times, my husband's an attorney, I'm a therapist, we are expert manipulators and arguers with each other. And there are times I get called out of, I don't need you to be my therapist. And there are times I have to call him out and say, don't you cross-examine me right now. I did mock trial in high school, sucker. Okay, point number 8. We need to push back on shame-saturated messaging by cultivating empathy and connection. The more shame-resilient we become, the more we can hear it in our communities, in our workplace. So when people are saying things like, well, people just don't want to work anymore, that's a shame-saturated message. It implies that a whole group of people is not good enough. We need to push back on that. And what's hard is when we push back on things, it provokes having to look at our own accountability. Oh, are people not wanting to work anymore because we're not creating work environments that are sustainable for people? Do I have a role in that? And so much of this is around our isms, right? Whether it's classism, ageism, all those things come from shame-saturated places. So notice what we're hearing at work. Another big one is, think of, if you're an attorney, think of the first case you were trying. Were you supported? Were you not supported? Some of you were met with messages of, well, you're going to have to get tough if you want to be in this field. And there's absolutely space to promote resilience. But also that's a really shame-saturated message to say, maybe you're not cut out for this. Maybe there needs to be training and adapting and support. Boundaries, we don't have all the time that I would love to dive into this. Boundaries are a really sexy term in the social media space right now, and a lot of people misunderstand what actual boundaries are. A lot of people are communicating expectations online, and here's the difference. Expectations are necessary. We need expectations to have a safe society. If I couldn't expect that I could walk out and be generally safe, that would be really scary. Boundaries are only what I can control. Expectation is what I want of things. Boundary is what I can control. So people say, oh, Jess, I have boundaries. I tell people they can't email me after 5. You can't control whether people will email you after 5. And sometimes those clients will even say, and I even yelled at them, was like, you can't email me after 5. I was like, hold your horses. That's really problematic because you can't control anybody else and you can't make a boundary bat and just beat people down because they're not doing what you want. A boundary is what you can control, which is yourself. So a boundary in that situation is I don't respond to emails after 5. Nobody's making you look at your email. No one's making them email you. But you can control whether you look at something or not. You can control whether you pull away from something, whether you're doing your deep breathing. You can control how you're regulating yourself in response to things. So boundaries are about what you can do. Love this depiction of what things are absolutely out of our control, what things we can influence, and what things are actually in our control. And the things that are in our control, it's just us. Just you as an individual. Your words, your reactions, your boundaries, whether you ask for support, your attitude, your perspective, your efforts to heal. Healing can take its time, but your efforts to move towards healing. Your media choices. I've been on a social media fast for the past half of a month. It's great. I can't control what comes on the news and I can't control what goes on in the world, but I can control my efforts to recuperate so I can go back fighting for the things that are really important. So much of struggle I see with my clients with workplace systems is when people are working within a sphere that they don't have control. And they need to work on that and manage that and pull themselves back to what they can actually control. And are we looking at that within our systems of influence, within our workplace systems? Are we pushing people to try to control things that they have no stewardship over or no ability to control? And that's going to produce a lot of anxiety and put us in the hot potato game. Okay, number 9, we need to lean into hard conversations and be open to receiving mindful feedback in addition to giving it. Feedback, I like to say, can be a really sacred space because somebody's opening themselves up to vulnerability and they're trusting you to be respectful and humble and honest about it too. But so many times we have experiences with feedback that are really hostile. They're really cruel and they're not exercised with a lot of tact. And that can be really damaging and burnout creating. So if we want a burnout preventing system, we need to understand that feedback needs to be given in a way that doesn't dehumanize the other person, that we're keeping our integrity intact by approaching people with compassion and honesty, and that those things go hand in hand. It's not that we're sparing people information that they need to be better, but that we are handling it with their humanity in mind. Huge rule in just conducting ourselves with anyone else is to say what you mean and mean what you say. This goes back to boundaries a little bit too. You say no when you want to say no, or do you plaster that smile on your face and say, sure, that's great, I'll do it, yeah, it's fine. If you don't choose a boundary, a lot of times you end up choosing a resentment. So are we actually taking up space and showing up as we are? Instead of choosing resentment, instead of choosing that additional strain and emotional conundrum that can be really hard. And do we have a whole pileup of that is producing burnout for ourselves? When we say what we mean and mean what we say, it allows the people that we work with, the people we have stewardship over, to also give themselves permission to do that. So we've got to model it, okay? What do we get sworn in for? To say the truth and nothing but the truth, so help us God? We bring God into it? Are we showing up and taking up space and actually saying how we feel about something? Doesn't mean you have to be mean or a jerk about it, but are you showing up honestly? Okay, last point. This process is allowed to be messy, but as we keep leaning into it and giving grace for each other along the way, we can shape new cultures and ways of engaging. I really love this quote. Brene Brown mentions it quite a bit in her book, Daring Greatly, and I wanted to end with it. This is from Theodore Roosevelt. And he says, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there's no effort without error or shortcoming. But who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat. This is really system-changing information. And it's gonna be uncomfortable and will absolutely draw you right into the arena. We're challenging rules and ideas that whole cultures are built on, and they're not serving us. And you have a right to audit those rules and that culture if you want something to be better, if you need something to be better. I would argue we desperately need things to be better. So this is gonna be uncomfortable. And it has permission to be messy. I hope that this information helps you feel empowered to go in and do that messy work. Thank you so much for having me.